Either we believe in this Word made flesh, this involved goodness of God, this overflowing love in human fragile flesh, or we don't. Now, for Francis, because he so believed this with all that he was, the whole point of his life was to make Christ alive. There's the good news. You know, the good news of making Jesus Christ alive in the human person. And you might say, we could look at 4 points that could help make this Christ alive as Francis lived it. 1, he placed the human person as the center of life. The human person was not an object, you know, or a social security number, or, you know, every time you call these days, or, you know, you have to identify yourself. You don't identify yourself today as your name, it's what's your number. You know, what's your social security number, where are you in the queue? So we're just kind of it's in the culture. But for Francis, the human person was the center of gospel life. Why? Because the Word becomes flesh. God has become one of us. And therefore, it's a life that is relational. It's dialogical, and we enter into that relationship of life through prayer. So we're going to take each of these points. First, the human person. The word incarnation means to become flesh. God becomes one of us. Not just one with us, but one of us. And that, for the human mind, is hard to rationalize, you see, because it's not rational. This is a totally irrational God we have, sort of. Okay, don't put that on tape, all right? Irrational in the sense that we, if we can't figure it out, we don't believe it, you know, or we believe it very skeptically. You know, we're skeptical. We think, maybe, you know, 60-40. But Francis, because he wasn't so much a skeptic, because he experienced God's love in Jesus Christ, he saw the human person, as you might say, the tip of creation. All of creation, you might say, is recapitulated in the human person. He himself was struck by God's love for him. And often he would pray, "Who are you, O Lord, and who am I? Who am I that I can even cry out to you? You know, who am I as a human person that can even pray to you?" So he understood that kind of mystery of being human. I always say the mystery is of the human person, not of God. God is quite simple. God is infinite, overflowing love. We, on the other hand, are complex human beings. Francis, therefore, as he enters into this union with a God of love in and through Jesus Christ, he begins to recognize he cannot be an isolated I. For Francis, you cannot be a Christian and cut yourself off from everyone else. I don't need you, you know, I like you, I don't need you. So for Francis, the more he grew into his relationship with Christ, the more he realized he was an I in relation to a thou. His was an I-thou relationship. And he began to live out of this relationship, and as he did so, he recognized his own God-gifted self. And I think that is one of the essences of Christian life, is simply coming to recognize ourselves as gifts of God, embodied goodness of God, and therefore related to God. You know, Thomas Merton speaks of the false self and the true self. We're always in our culture running after a self, the false self, that God didn't create and God knows nothing of. What Francis, you might say, moved from what was this, you know, undivine self, the false self, to a true self, a self created by God. So Francis, as he comes home to himself, and that's really what we're talking about here, a coming home to oneself. That's what Francis did. In other words, he didn't try to be something other than what God created. And as he came home to his own self, he came to be a brother to others, a person in relationship. And this relational brotherhood was really a sharing of God's goodness. Basically, what Francis realized is, gee, I know God's goodness in my life, and you too must bear God's goodness in your life, and therefore we must be related. We must be family. And for him, that relationship of God's love, God's ultimate goodness, was the heart of mutuality, the heart of being related. Here's a picture, in case you're not sure what being related looks like. Here's a kind of a picture, of relationality. Now, part of this relationality, as I look at it in Francis, is letting the other be. One of the reasons we can never enter fully into mutuality or mutual relationships, we're always trying to make other people into ourselves. We want them to think like us, to look like us, even to act like us, possibly. Today I was with Sister Pat, and I was telling her that I live in Washington, D.C., where I live in an Afro-American neighborhood. We are probably 5% white amongst 95% Afro-American. We have a second large Hispanic population. And for me, not to be in a multicultural environment almost seems odd. Now, there's nothing odd about you here today, but I'm so, we're so used to being with quote-unquote our own that it's hard sometimes to accept someone who's different from us. That's a key for Francis. He went beyond the visible to see the invisible goodness of God because it was real for him. It was there. And it's in that letting be, letting others be who they are, that God's goodness shines out. So for Francis, the primary focus of the life is not work or prayer, but the human person. Duns Scotus uses the word hekcheitos, a thisness, to point to individuality. Each person has a particular thisness. This person is loved by God in this particular way and not that. It's a unique being that cannot be cloned, that cannot be reproduced, although science might have us think otherwise. And that's what Francis, he embraces the thisness in every person and everything. This evangelical life, therefore, is a relational life. And we can look at this living in relationship first as living within the reality of God's gift. All is gift. And for Francis, that included even his enemies, even the brothers who didn't like him. And there were a lot of them as they started to accumulate. Sometimes we think the saints have wonderful, happy lives. They never have a bad day, never a bad hair day. It's just the opposite. Most of the saints' lives, and this is true for Francis in particular, are very difficult lives. Very difficult. And the difference is, one of the differences, the saints see everything we see, but they see in a deeper way. They see in a deeper way because they come home to themselves and where God lives. Second is, they persevere in love. They persevere. They are so trusting in God's involved goodness, they don't give up. And that's what Francis did. He began to see this structure of God's goodness as a luminous web of love, uniting persons to persons, persons to creation.